Hello, everyone. Welcome to our November 26th installment and a continuation of the question of pastoral assessment. I want to introduce a consideration of the role of tradition and doctrine in pastoral assessment. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is because there are usually assumptions and preconditions to how we go about what we do. As an example, it's not uncommon in baptism interviews, for instance, to have somebody tell me what baptism really is about. And although I would say it's probably legitimate to hear what they have to say about what baptism means to them or any other aspect of church life, but that it's often a matter of the unchurched telling the church what to think and what to believe. So I want to start by just making a division that may or may not be relevant to you, although I think it is. And arguably, the Christian church can be divided into four parts: Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, Reformed, and holiness traditions. Now, the differences between us are not critical difference. When I say that to be Protestant means X, Y, Z, it doesn't mean that the holiness people are wrong. It means it's a different perspective, but a valid difference nonetheless. And in order to be aware of and respect differences, we have to acknowledge them, first of all. These differences are important in both the positive and a decisive sense. Trinity, for instance, is a symbol of the diversity within God. And it's what God makes complete, and I would have to say that diversity in the church is part of what makes us complete, although there are sometimes critical differences that arise from that. It's nothing uncommon for somebody from another tradition to say, well, you're wrong. There's a Catholic priest locally who won't accept baptisms that were done in the church that I recently served for almost 8 years because a predecessor, twice removed, used to do baptisms that were not ecumenically acceptable. It becomes a problem. So I want to first refer to John Dillenberger, who was a church historian. He did a lot of work on Mormonism, an American church historian, but he also wrote a book about Protestant Christianity. And he said Christianity breaks down into two parts, Protestant versus Catholic. And keep in mind that to be Protestant does not mean to be non-Catholic. And he would say that there are two approaches. One where your relationship to God depends on your relationship to your religion, and the second where your relationship to your religion depends upon your relationship to God, the latter being Protestantism. Now, this is a very ancient kind of perspective. It can be said that the story of Abraham and the near sacrifice of Isaac is an example of that, where Abraham challenged the time-honored tradition of sacrificing the eldest child to God, and he broke that tradition. He broke that pattern decisively in the story that we hear about, and it's across religions. Siddhartha Gautama challenged the temple religion of Hinduism. Muhammad challenged the understanding he had with his encounters with Judaism and Christianity. Luther in the 16th century is an ideal example of that. And even Jesus challenged temple Judaism in respect to his particular form of Pharisaism and Pharisaic religion that was one of having your relationship to God depend upon your relationship to your religion. Protestant Reformed theology belongs to the latter, of course. The primary differences between Protestantism and Reformed churches is that Protestant religion emphasizes justification by faith, and the Reformed traditions emphasize forms of predestination, and they're many and diverse. I remember hearing many a lively argument when I belonged to an ecumenical ministerial. So like it or not, there is a diversity within Christian faith, and we cannot be responsible to uphold each other's perspective necessarily. Now, the United Church of Canada tends to, and our leaders seem to emphasize, a value for the appearance of harmony, and so sometimes we bring in other traditional perspectives when we don't even really understand our own traditions. Years ago, I remember when I was taking a supervised pastoral education program at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto. There were two or three of us who were enjoying a conversation on our diversity and differences, and it was lively and it was friendly. But two participants, one from the United Church of Canada, one from the Anglican Church, previously Roman Catholic, overwhelmed the conversation, saying, "There is no difference, there is no difference." So the rest of us went on our merry months, and we got on fine, but the two who were into this kind of synthesis and syncretism between the two, they ended up being in constant argument over their perspectives and never really got to understand each other, because to them it meant no difference, but it would seem from the evidence that it made all the difference. I personally enjoy ecumenical conversations with no agenda to try to change the view of the others. We should be educating each other, not converting each other. Anyway, what I want you to do is I want you to think about some of the aspects of our work as pastoral ministers, and to think deeply about what it is we believe. Not just I believe, not just my own beliefs, but also to work within the rubrics and the faith and the statements and traditions of where we come from. And to think about these encounters: baptism, the Lord's Supper, marriage, and yes, as we've been discussing, funerals as well. In the last few years, for instance, most of my requests for baptisms and marriage have come from families in which one or the other, or both of the couples both people in the union were Roman Catholic. And either wanted to get married because they couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. Maybe one of them had been divorced and hadn't gotten a proper annulment. Maybe they weren't attending church, and that was the most common. So it was very important pastorally that I informed the Catholics that a wedding presided over by a non-Roman Catholic priest outside of the Catholic Church would not be considered valid within the Catholic Church. That was important for them to know. At no point ever did it ever create a problem for them. Most of my requests for baptisms, and in the last 7.5 years, I presided at 99 baptisms in 7.5 years. My congregation had a proud convention of baptizing anybody and everybody who came. And even when I brought in a restriction that godparents had to be baptized in Christian faith, was protested, and at times it became somewhat controversial. But most of those who came for baptism were also Roman Catholics who wanted their children to attend separate schools, Roman Catholic schools. And I had two problems with that, as I did lesser so with the weddings. One is, I'm not sure that's our problem. The second is, it was an ethical issue to me that Catholics were coming to us for baptism, and yes, the Roman Catholics, generally speaking, abide within our bipartisan agreement to accept each other's baptism. But they were coming to us because they didn't want to have anything to do with a commitment to the Roman Catholic faith, which they continued to claim as their own. And it seemed to me that we were creating a diversion, an alternative to life in Christian community. Well, that's no longer a problem I have. I'm retired. It's unlikely I'm going to be asked to preside at any baptisms anytime soon. But those are the kinds of things that come out. Think deeply. I mean, we don't really have a theology of marriage within the United Church of Canada. Back in 2002, I think it was, when same-sex marriages were made legal in the province of Ontario, we being clergy, were asked to create a marriage policy, something clear, something preemptive. And my people would not, in the pastoral charge I served at that time, my people would not meet. They didn't want to get into the controversy. So I did what I hate to do, but as transparently as possible, I asked for people to volunteer to talk to me about it. And if I interviewed 20 people, one couple who were quite conservative politically and theologically, who were great contributors to the church, hard workers as well, and who got things done and who initiated many things, said that if we agreed to the marriage of same-sex couples, they would leave the church. And the other couple, who were very, very liberal in their social outlook and were great idea people but never actually followed through or got much done, said that if we didn't do it, they would leave the church. I just love those kinds of threats. And the rest of them went, eh. But for all of them, they saw marriage as a legal effort, a legal conclusion to and beginning of what they called marriage. They had no theological basis for what they did. There was no faith commitment to that. No matter how hard I prod, no matter how hard I tried to extract, I never got anything beyond that. Well, I developed a statement of best practices rather than a policy, and it never came up. When I first came to the pastorate I last served at Sault Ste. Marie, within 6 weeks I was asked if I would preside at a same-sex marriage. There was no policy because my predecessor didn't want to deal with the issue back in 2002. And when I went to the worship committee and said, I don't know what to do, and I need to know what you want done. And it took 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And there was no big announcements, and I was never asked. I never, after that time, they went to somebody else, and I was happy to refer them to somebody who had already done the heavy lifting. And we continued on our way, and I was never asked again. Back in '88, when the issue was on the table, there was a huge furor, and in Sault Ste. Marie, and I wasn't living here at the time, there were two ministers in particular who created deep hurt in the United Churches across the city for their opposition to same-sex marriage and homosexuality, the LGBTQ community, and that hostility became a taint that exists here to this day. Now, interestingly enough, some of those people who were most against it, and this is the case with that conservative couple in my previous pastorate I was talking about, learned afterwards that a valued nephew or niece or grandchild was gay, and they changed their mind. And I've known clergy, including one of the clergy who created such conflict here in Sault Ste. Marie, who did the same thing. I would encourage you not to wait until you have a personal reason. We should have theological reasons to preemptively understand what we're doing when we do baptisms, when we have the Lord's Supper, when we officiate at marriages, and yes, at funerals as well. I had a friend who was a Roman Catholic priest who eventually became a bishop, and he would not bury anybody who died of alcoholism, and he would not marry anyone who had had a child out of wedlock. God bless him, he at least was preemptive in that. He was a great guy, wonderful man, and he was very thoughtful about it, and he was very caring. But nevertheless, that's where it stood. I encourage you to think deeply about these events and other events in the pastoral life, and try to formulate within our traditions, within our teachings, within our doctrine as it stands, some idea. What does it mean? Who is baptism for? What is the Lord's Supper? The three primary categories are that the elements are transubstantiated, that has literally become the body of blood of Christ, and the fact that it looks like a wafer and some wine is just an accident. A very Thomistic view, 12th century. Is it a question of consubstantiation? This is kind of where I'm at. Martin Luther developed the concept, but never named it consubstantiation, where God is contained within the elements. God is in. It's a reference to an old, ancient Judaic principle of Shekinah, to dwell within. Shekinah refers to she who pitches her tent among us. And I think it's wonderfully comforting to know that the God of all things and the God of all creation can fit into my pocket, if that God so wishes to. Marriage. What is it that we do in marriage? Is it simply some kind of unholy alliance with the powers that be in the political structures and the bureaucracy of our governments? Or is this a covenantal action? There was one instance had many years ago, and I'm certainly not the only person, who, when they came to the point in their lives when they wanted to get married, were both pensioners. And for whatever reason, getting married officially would have created a loss of pension for one of them. It might have been a widow's pension. I don't know. I don't know what that was about. So we formed a covenant. And the covenant to me is as valid theologically as is the paperwork for the official marriage. Common law kicks in anyway, so it's not really an issue, and you can do what you want with your wills at that point. So what is it we do in marriage? And again, back to funerals and what that stands for. In my view, a funeral, Christian funeral, is a service of worship. It's non-negotiable. It doesn't have to be over heavy-handed on the theology or proclaiming Christ, but it is a proclamation of the hope and resurrection. And anybody and everybody should have access to that for the request. It's not a sacrament for us, and it's not an issue. There was a time just before I was ordained, and I had a really rough time getting ordained. I was 7 years in candidacy and went through candidacy twice. And everything was done. And I was on my way to finishing my doctorate. I'd been serving a large church in Richmond Hill. I was really having a great time working at the university as well as my doctoral work. And I was going to give my first sermon as an ordained minister in Richmond Hill United, where Bob Smith and, Bruce McLeod and Song Chul Lee had preached. Linda Butler, who was never a church bureaucrat but was a wonderful preacher, was there afterwards. I just was full of myself. And then I got a phone call from the funeral home, and a street person had been found dead. He had just reconnected with his family after many, many years, the week before. And they couldn't afford to pay me, and would I do the service? And of course I said yes. And that was my first sermon as a ordained minister. And I'm still kind of pleased as punch that that happened. What is your theological understanding of the very diverse tasks and encounters of this pastoral life? I'm not expecting answers this time, although if you want to start kicking that one around, I'd be happy to read about it. We don't have to go back to it at any point, but we are going to be talking more about doctrine at a later date. Now, for December 7th, I, at this point, don't expect to have anything online for you, although I might. I don't know. But what I want to do is receive your practicum projects so that I can mark them and move through that. Anybody who's already handed in the practicum, if you want to take another look at what you handed in, I will receive your later, your edited version gladly up to December 7th. So if you don't hear from me, enjoy your Advent and Christmas and enjoy the work that you have to do. I know that you're stressed to get it all done. And I will be seeing you in the new year if I don't, if you don't hear from me before then. Of course, I will be telling you about your practicum projects as I grade them. Thank you, and we'll see you in the new year. Bye for now.